Last week, we introduced what I refer to as the testing narratives in the book of Exodus. After God brought Abraham's descendants out of Egypt, brought them to and then across the Red Sea on dry ground, he then leads them into the wilderness because he's planning on bringing them to Mount Sinai, where they're going to enter into a covenant in chapter 24. He's going to provide them with the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. He's going to give them the law, the statutes, the ordinances, how it is that they are going to build the tabernacle, the significance of it, all of those things. But before they actually get to Sinai, you have this series of events that takes place starting there in Exodus, the end of Exodus chapter 15, which we looked at last week. We talked about the bitter water there at Marah, where God declared himself as their healer, and then led them to a place called Elim, a place where there was food and water. It is at their departure from Elim that brings us to the next of the testing narratives in chapter 16, and that is God's deliverance of his people with manna. Good morning. Boy, it's good to be here this morning, isn't it? It's good to look around and see all the faces who are here, just to see so many people that are here to worship their God. It is definitely exciting, and I've thoroughly enjoyed so far the partaking of this feast together, the singing of the songs, the prayers, and now as we open up the Word of God, being able to spend some time in it to encourage us, to stimulate us to love and good works, encouraging us as the day approaches. I thank you very much for the opportunity that you provide for me to stand up here and have this opportunity to open up the Word of God with you. And I hope that we will be encouraged this morning as we look at it together. We do have some who are visiting with us, and we're really glad that you're here. We appreciate that you have chosen to be here with us this morning. And we do hope that you will find encouragement, that we all will, as we look at one of maybe the more well-known stories, or at least the reference, of manna that came in the wilderness. Now, we cheated just a little bit last week because I included the first part of this narrative and the ending last week for a purpose, but really this narrative begins in chapter 16, verse 1. They set out from Elim, and all the congregation, the people of Israel, came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month, after they departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness, and the people of Israel said to them, "Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full, for you have brought us out into the wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger." Now last week we did mention they'd left Marah, they came to Elim where there was plenty of water and there was food. Used some biblical numbers there, 1270, all of that, just to say they were well off. They were doing okay there at Elim, but we also made the point that wasn't their ending place. God had something a little bit more special than just this good enough place in mind, and so they leave. And as they leave, we are then brought to one of the probably the most iconic words associated with this Exodus generation, because as soon as they leave, they begin to grumble. The whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Obviously, they were concerned. They had enough there at Elim, things were okay. They get out and immediately they start saying, what are we going to do? Now, we're going to talk about this word a little bit more in just a few minutes, but here we see just the way that this group, their mode of operation, their default process, as soon as things aren't the way that they want it to be, they are grumbling. So what are they grumbling about? Here it's lack of food in the wilderness. Of course, we can look at them and we can see they're not going to starve anytime soon. They're okay. They came out of Egypt with lots of flocks. They've got lots of things that they're able to eat. This isn't a matter of them, just being there and looking around and saying there is absolutely nothing to eat. At the same time, keep in mind that there are lots of flocks and everything else. Those are kind of commodities for them. They're valuable. They didn't want to just eat up everything that they had before they went into the promised land. They're wanting to preserve their animals. They assuredly would have had diets that would have contained a lot more bread than meat, probably not a predominantly meat diet. And so they wouldn't have wanted to just start killing all the animals that they had right away for food. So they cry out to Moses and Aaron and say, "Why have you brought us here where we don't have the sustenance for our animals? We don't have the sustenance for ourselves. Things are going to go very poorly for us." In fact, look at their cry. "Oh, if only we were back in Egypt." Remember back in Egypt? Remember how great Egypt was? How exciting and wonderful. We had meat pots and we had bread to our fill. Completely forgetting the fact that they were crying out to God in Egypt for him to bring them out of it. But remember, we talked about this last week. That's gone from their mind. They're looking at the good old days when they had enough food to feed their bellies. And so they're saying, "Oh, that we'd simply died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. Because at least there, we had enough food." Now, remember this phrase. It's going to pop up again in a few weeks down the road as we kind of work our way through here. But remember this phrase, "Oh, that we would have died in." And here it's Egypt. And you're going to see Egypt crop up again, but then there's going to be another one at another date later on. So just kind of put that in, your memory back there and kind of write it on the chalkboard that you got there in your mind, and we will definitely come back to that. So we then move on into verses 4 through 12, the next section here. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people will go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily.' So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, 'At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?' And Moses said, 'When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord.' Then Moses said to Aaron, 'Say to all the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling.' And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, 'I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God.'" So God hears their grumbling, he hears their complaining, and he does kind of the same thing that he did while they were in Egypt, right? When they complained and cried out to him, he delivers them. He gives them what it is they need. And we're going to see that through these testing narratives, that God doesn't say, "Hey, shut up, I'm not going to help you." He comes through. He does deliver. He does help them. But understand, at least the way that this is written, you're supposed to see something here. In fact, the author here is trying to take a 2x4 and smack you in the head over and over and over, because there's a lot of repetition that's taking place here. And I hope that you caught it, because there's a lot of repetition that is taking place here in this section. Hopefully, I tried to stress it a little bit as you go through, but did you see what word was stated again and again and again and again and again and again? I mean, just over and over. Now, the Hebrew language is actually pretty efficient. You don't have a lot of repetition that takes place in the Hebrew text unless either the author's trying to be clever and be funny and make some type of thing. That happens sometimes where you get some repetition. Or this is an emphatic point, and he's trying to make sure that you see just how important this word is to this text. And considering the fact that until last week, what we looked at there in chapter 15, the chapter before, the word grumble does not appear in the Bible. It's not there until just a chapter ago, when Adam and Eve never grumbled according to the text. In the time of Noah, they did not grumble. In the time of Abraham, nobody grumbled. Through the patriarchs, nobody grumbled. Time goes on, and it's not until this generation comes out of Egypt, finds themselves in the wilderness, that for the very first time, at the end of chapter 15, they grumble. And then the very next chapter, this word appears 8 times. 7 of them right here. We saw the first one just a second ago in the first 3 verses, right? 7 more times, a word that has never been used yet, all the way through Genesis, now almost halfway through Exodus, and it gets smattered all over the page. That's significant. That tells you a whole lot about just how this is. It's remarkable. 7 times. From that, we're supposed to see what the real issue is. The people are grumbling. And they grumble to Moses and Aaron, but all the repetition that you find up here is supposed to emphatically say, when you're grumbling, you're not grumbling against God's representatives. You know, Moses and Aaron, they're saying, who are we? What are you complaining to us about? We're not the ones that have done this. You're complaining to us. We're nothing. You're really complaining against God. And that's what is emphatically stated over and over. Perhaps that's the reason for such repetition. To be that reminder over and over about the Exodus generation. And for every generation after this that's going to look back at the Exodus generation, the complaints that are made, doesn't matter to whom you make those complaints. The complaints that are made to God. You may say them to someone else, you may direct them at someone else, but when a person is complaining about the circumstances, they are complaints to God, directly to God, not God's representatives. And the answers come from God as well. See, there's another word that's a carryover from last week, another word that's used, and that is the word test. It's why I call these the testing narratives. The first time that the word test shows up is Genesis chapter 22. If you'll remember, that's where God tests Abraham with the binding of Isaac. And he tells Isaac to go and tells Abraham to offer Isaac. That's the first time that the word test is used as God is testing his people. The second time, we looked at it last week. Only the second time God tested Abraham, now God is testing Abraham's descendants, and he does it at the waters of Merah, and now he's testing them again. And the test, of course, yes, does include seeing how they're going to react by being brought into a place without food, but there's something else to this test as well. Just like last week, there's another element that's involved. This is going to be a test to see whether the people will actually follow God's instructions. When he gives them their instructions, are they going to fulfill what he says? It's a test of faith. And we'll talk about that more in a moment. But it's introduced here. God brought them out here, gave them, he says, I'm going to rain down this bread from heaven, so that I may test them, whether they will obey me, walk in my law or not. Now, one more thing to take note of from this section that is very much like last week's is perhaps a connection with the plagues of Egypt. Remember, we said last week that God took water that was not usable, and then he made it usable. He healed it. And that was in direct connection to the first place, where God took usable water in the land of Egypt, turned it into blood so that it wasn't usable. And those two are connected. Well, the way that here he says that he is about to rain bread from heaven. Perhaps there is a connection to his idea of raining bread, and that in Exodus chapter 9 and verse 23, where the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. It was one of the plagues in which God actually brought from the sky and used the language of raining destructive hail, raining stones down in order to obliterate their food so that they wouldn't have any food to eat. That's the destroyer, the destructor God that they were used to. Now God is showing the other side, where he says, now I'm not just the God who's going to destroy my enemies, I'm also the God who doesn't rain hail down from heaven, I rain bread down from heaven in order to take care of those who are my people. And so you have another juxtaposition between the plagues in Egypt and then God's healing or taking care of them in the wilderness. And so you see all of these connections right here. And yeah, I can't help but see the idea of raining down upon seems to really connect these thoughts. You then see in verse 12 what all of this is really about. At twilight you shall eat meat, in the morning you shall be filled with bread. Then you will know that I am the Lord your God. Just like last week, we said that God did this. He healed the waters. And then after doing this, he said, this is a sign. Remember, just like in the Gospel of John, when you have these I am statements that are attached to the different signs that are given. You know, when he opens the eyes of the blind, he says, now you know I am the light of the world. Brings Lazarus from the tomb. Now you know I am the resurrection and the life. Well, last week, he healed the waters and said, now you know I am your healer. And by doing this, he now says, then you shall all know I am the Lord your God. And so we see another connection, this idea, this signifying of who and what he is, the signs in the wilderness declaring who God is. Now we move then into starting verse 13. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. In the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it's the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each of you, as much as he can eat. You shall take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered some more, some less, but when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over. Whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till the morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning, and it bred worms and it stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it as much as he could eat, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. Well, what God promised, he provides. He told them, I'm going to give you meat in the evening, I'm going to give you bread in the morning, and that's exactly what they get. They receive quail in the evening, and then you have this strange food substance in the morning that came out as the dew left. And we know what this substance is. We've known what this substance is, many of us, since we were about yay high, and we had Bible class teachers who were giving us little pieces of bread and calling it manna, right? Or cornflakes or something like that. We know what it is because we've always known what manna is. They had never seen it before. They'd never heard of it before. There's a whole lot of new things that are going on in this section. In fact, they walk outside, they look at it, and they say, what is this stuff? Now, in the Hebrew, here's what they would have said, manu, because that means, what is it? Manu, what is it? That sounds a lot like manna, right? Because that's all they're saying. The word manna literally is it's kind of an abbreviated, shortened form of the phrase, what is this? That's all manna means. So when you ever hear manna, manna just simply is them saying, what is it? And it's like, yeah, it's like a who's on first kind of thing, right? What is it? Exactly. It's what is it? It's manna. It wasn't what they were expecting. It wasn't what they thought of. They were thinking of all the bread that they had in Egypt. They were expecting the normal stuff that they would have been used to with the meat pots and the bread and all of that. And then God sends this stuff to them. They're like, what even is it? Well, yeah, that's their deliverance. That's what it is. That is their manna. And they're told to go gather whatever it was they needed. And it seems no matter how much they gathered, whether they tried to overload their bowls or not, it always measured out to exactly what they needed to take care of their family. An omer for each person. I think this is probably miraculous, that it's kind of punishing those people who are overloading just a little bit, who are trying to take full advantage. The ones who say, we probably haven't had a whole lot of food in the past little bit. Who knows when God's just going to take us up from here, take us away from the place where this what is it grows, whatever it is, and he's going to take us somewhere else and we're not going to have it anymore. I'm going to get just a little bit extra here. We're going to store some back just to make sure. And then they get up to measure it. No, you're not. It's exactly an omer. And by the way, what exactly an omer is somewhat irrelevant to the story, right? It's an amount that's needed. The important thing is for us to see that they have a very specific amount that they're given, and they're told not to keep any of it overnight. Well, I don't know about you, but I've got some leftovers in our house right now. Some of y'all might have some leftovers sitting there. Purpose of leftovers is when you kind of don't eat it all, you make sure that come tomorrow, maybe you got a little bit to eat, right? You think you might have been tempted as an Israelite who's crying out to God saying, you know what, God, I don't have enough to eat. We've traveled a whole lot. This wilderness doesn't give us enough food. And you walk out and suddenly there's plenty of food. How many of y'all might have been tempted to say, I think I'm going to save a little bit of this? The last time that I was in a really good place where there was plenty of food, God said, all right, let's go. Let's be gone. And he took us where there wasn't. Can we actually trust him? He's going to keep giving us more of this manna? I don't know. Some people might have been tempted to have, let me correct that. Some people did hold it over until the morning. And what they found out in the morning is that leftover manna is horrible. You do not want to keep this stuff. Just like that. Another miraculous type of thing, by the way, because an immediate overnight growth of worms in it, maggots, whatever the case, and it stank. It was rotten. This was an immediate thing. This is an immediate punishment. And by the way, does Moses know that there were people who kept it overnight? Yeah. Because those are the people that are screaming in disgust and tossing stuff out of their tent, right? They're the ones that, oh, this is nasty. Oh, Elijah, take this stuff out. I mean, I don't want to touch it. It's why you have kids, right? You take this stuff out and dump it outside the camp. This is disgusting. And Moses is able to look around and say, well, that tent did it, that tent. Yeah, he knows exactly who it is that is not listening to the voice of the Lord, is not passing the test that was given that they would be obedient. See, these are tests to see if people would listen to the law that God had given. And really, it's not even just let's understand, or let me look at how well you understand and comprehend rules. This is do you really trust God? That's the question. You don't hold it over until morning because, you just didn't hear what he said properly. You're holding it over because you're saying, God, I don't know if I can trust that you're going to provide for me again. I'm holding this. I'm going to hoard this. I'm going to keep it because I don't trust the promise that you've given. That's the problem. Now, while we're talking about this manna, what is the significance of raining down this manna from heaven? I want to go back to Genesis chapter 3. I say that. I'm just going to put a verse up on the screen here in a second. We're not going to go all the way through Genesis 3. But what's the point of God providing them with this bread that all they have to do is go out and gather it? Remember part of the curse in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 19? He tells Adam, by the sweat of your face you will eat bread until you return to the ground. For you're made of dust, from dust you came, to dust you will return. By the sweat of your brow, by the sweat of your face, by hard work, by hard labor. That's actually the word that's used earlier, in labor, toil, pain. It's the exact same word that he uses to describe childbirth when he talks to Eve. It's the exact same word that he says, by labor you will till the ground. You're going to take care of it. And then right here he says, you will sweat. You're going to have hard work. It's going to be laborious because God is not going to just give you every tree growing up out of the ground for you to simply go out and pick and eat now. You're being removed from that garden existence, and you're going out into a world where you're going to now have to deal with those thorns and those thistles. You are going to sweat in order to eat bread. Unless you're an Israelite in the wilderness in Exodus chapter 16. Because here, God just puts the bread out there. There's no sweating involved. There's no toil. There's no labor. They just walk out there and they grab it to make their bread. You see, this is God totally circumventing the curse that he gave to them when he said, by sweat you will eat your bread. Yeah, they're having to gather the bread, but they don't have to sweat. There's no pain. There's no toil. They're not working in the fields. They're not cultivating it. They're not going through all of that. Folks, when God provides manna in the wilderness, he's taking his people back to Eden. He's going back to a pre-Genesis 3 time frame. He's letting them kind of taste what a pre-fall creation, in just a limited sense, what it's all about. Seeing this connection of going back to pre-Genesis chapter 3, maybe it makes sense with the next reference that's given here. And that is, in starting verse 22 through 30, on the sixth day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers each. And when all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord's commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you will bake, boil what you will boil, and all that is left over lay aside to be kept until the morning. So they laid it aside till the morning, as Moses had commanded. And it did not stink. There were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in a field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. So on the seventh day, some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, the Lord's given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the sixth day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain, each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the seventh day. So the people rested on the seventh day. So the people are told, you've got this manna, and you're supposed to gather enough for yourself and not leave it overnight. Oh, by the way, 1 day out of the week, you're supposed to gather enough, twice as much for yourself and everyone else, and you are going to save that overnight and eat it tomorrow. Can you see how this might cause a little confusion? I mean, this is a complete contradiction. I'm sure we can appreciate this. Can you imagine those people? The ones who had already set the manna out, right? They tried to keep some of it back. And when they woke up, their whole tent stank to high heaven. And they looked at it, and it was rotten, had worms, and they threw it out. And they were like, well, I learned about that mistake. I'm not doing that again. And then Moses says, yeah, you need to do that again. Seeing is believing, right? They saw what happens when you leave it out overnight. They looked at it. They've experienced it. And they're like, I don't want my tent to stink like that again. I don't want to go through this. I'm not sure about this. Now you're telling me that I do need to save it overnight on Fridays? Yeah, that's going to be a tough sell probably for some of these people. Again, it was a tough sell, apparently, for some of these people, because there were people who got up on Saturday morning and went outside to look for it, and it wasn't there. So what's the whole deal with this Sabbath business? Now, we get it, right? If I were to ask, are any of y'all familiar with the Sabbath day? A lot of hands here are going to go up because we understand the Sabbath. We understand that God worked through 6 days, and then on the seventh day he rested. And then he tells all of Israel that you're going to work for 6 days, and then the seventh day you're going to rest. In fact, I took the time to put together an entire bulletin article that talks about the Sabbath day and all the nuances of it and what it's all about. And I would suggest, not right now, but at some point this afternoon or something, pull out the bulletin article, take a look at it. Because there's a lot of information tangential to what we're talking about right here that helps us to understand what is the significance of this whole Sabbath. But these people, they've never heard of the Sabbath before. This is another first, by the way. The first time the word Sabbath is used in the Bible is right here in Exodus chapter 16. They didn't follow the Sabbath in the garden, the time of Noah, the time of Abraham, or the other patriarchs. They didn't abide by the Sabbath day the entire time that they were in the land of Egypt. This is a brand new concept that's being placed on them right here in the wilderness as part of a ritual with this food. There's a whole lot of newness, and God isn't even going to explain it until you get to chapter 20 when he gives them the Decalogue. We have not heard about the Sabbath yet, and they're looking at it and they're saying, why? What's the significance? How are we supposed to make heads or tails of why we're doing this? And notice, not only is this the first time the word Sabbath is used, but a lot of repetition. 4 different times. This word never shown up before, and then here it is all over the page, 4 different times. In just a short cluster of verses, the word Sabbath is used. Again, until they get to Sinai and get the 10 Commandments, they're not even going to know what the big deal is. All they know right now is God says, hey, be weird on Friday. Do this. And then Saturday, it may not make much sense to you right now, but don't go out. And some people went out. Some people went out anyway. So just making sure we understand this passage, even though they don't know what the Sabbath is, this is a foreshadowing. It's an introduction. It's the beginning of an idea of Sabbath rest that's going to be important throughout all the scriptures and just as important to Christians as it was for the Israelites. The Sabbath is just as much a part of who and what we are as it was what they were. And so we talk about the Sabbath. What's the point? Again, spend some time with the bulletin article. But just to give you a very brief look, it harkens back to a pre-cursed time. It was the time that God was spending with his creation, a fellowship with them, appreciating what they shared together. It wasn't a day of rest as much as it was the day that God had finished and was now enjoying it. It's like when you build a play structure for your kids or maybe your grandkids. What's the first thing that you do? You don't just sit there and admire it. You bring your kids over and let them play in it, right? And you play in it with them. You enjoy it together. You don't keep working on it once the work's completed. And the whole purpose is not just to have a play set, but it's to be used and enjoyed together. That's what the Sabbath was. God took man after he'd created all of it, put man in and said, okay, let's have this relationship together. And then Genesis 3 came and all of that changed. Man is removed from the garden. The path back to God is blocked and guarded. But God said, you know what? I want to keep this feeling of this Sabbath completion relationship. And so every day or every week we're going to have a day where we kind of act like Genesis 3 never happened. I'm going to take care of you. And you are going to focus on your relationship with me. You don't have to go out and work. You don't have to gather for yourselves. I'm going to make sure that you've got enough manna stored, and it's going to last you. So what would they do instead? They should focus on their relationship with God. Yeah, it was a day of rest, but it's not a day to sit back, relax, and turn on college football and enjoy your Saturday. It was a day to bask in God's rest and enjoy being the pinnacle of his creation. Now, this is going to be fleshed out more, like I said, in chapter 20, when the Sabbath is actually commanded in the Ten Commandments, but it's first introduced here with manna as a test. So did they trust God? Did they listen to him? Did they believe, despite the evidence that they saw, that manna was going to be just fine overnight? Well, many did, and ate on Friday and Saturday and ate stuff that didn't stink, but some did not. Some went out to gather and they found nothing. And again, it's a very clear indication of who has faith or not. All Moses has to do is look out and look at all the tents where people are coming out and they're bewildered because there's no food to gather, and says, you guys are the ones that have no faith. It's a very clear indication. And keep in mind, this one's kind of worse than the other because at least before, you could toss the bad manna out, but then you could go and gather the stuff for today. If you didn't gather enough yesterday, you're kind of out of luck. And you and your family, you're not eating. This is much worse, not honoring the Sabbath than the other. So, I hope you can see a pattern that's kind of emerging here. As God provides tests for his people, there are people who are going to fail. And what we're going to see next week is kind of where this is heading and what it really means. But you see here in verses 31 through 35, the house of the Lord, the house of Israel, called its name Manna. It was like a coriander seed, white. The taste of it was like wafers made with honey. Moses said, "This is what the Lord's commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generations, so that they may see the bread which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." Moses said to Aaron, "Take a jar, put an omer of manna into it, place it before the Lord to be kept throughout your generations. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years, till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna, till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. And an omer, by the way, is the 10th part of an ephah. God wanted this moment to be remembered. He had an omer, which is enough for one person's daily ration. They're going to place it in the Ark of the Covenant. Now, they don't have the Ark of the Covenant yet. That's not going to come till the end of Exodus. So they're going to do something with it for the time being until the Ark is there. But when it comes around, that's where they're going to put it. To be a memorial throughout all the generations God provided for his people in the wilderness. And then you get this editorial note down here at the last bullet. The people of Israel ate the manna for 40 years till they came to a habitable land, and they ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. This is an editor that comes back and just gives little editing notes that you see throughout the 5 books of Moses. Just like last week, this section ends with a reminder, this stuff, it's pretty good. It's good enough to sustain them. It's good enough to help them, but it's not on the same level of what they're going to get. God is taking them to a land that's flowing with milk and honey, that has everything that they need to take care of themselves and all of their livestock and everything else. And he's saying, maybe this man is good for now, but not the long run. Excuse me. So, they're going to a place where they will have good stuff. So what do we learn from all of this? Just very briefly, a couple things here, a few things. First of all, we talked about this last week. God tests his people. That's why I call these the testing narratives, because they are tests. Sometimes God does indeed put people through tests in order to demonstrate their faith or lack thereof. And it's going to come to light. This is what Hebrews chapter 11 is all about, going into chapter 12. It's not, by the way, and I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point, it's not a hall of fame of faith. It's a list of faithful actions that were done by people. It's not about the people, it's about the actions that were done by faith. And it's not people who lived a faithful life, it's about people who came to a moment and said, I'm going to make the decision right here or right now that demonstrates my faith. And so it's important that we see that's what we may come up with in our own lives. God always has and continues, according to the Hebrews writer, to test his people to see if they will live by faith, if they will choose the easy path, or if they will choose the faith path. Let's choose faith and trust every time. Secondly, another one, we talked about this as well, grumbling is easy. When things are going well, there's no real reason to get upset and grumble, but here's the question, when things aren't going so well, is grumbling or complaining our default response? The problem with the Exodus generation wasn't necessarily that they happened to grumble. The problem is that every time any situation came up, they grumbled a lot. Every instance is followed by grumbling. Every time something happens, they're complaining. Folks, it's not a good way to go through life. Bill Downey Jr. this past Thursday night talked about this idea of being content, this idea of not complaining, going to God in Philippians chapter 4. It's one thing to just kind of complain every now and then because life hands you something that's worthy of complaining about. But there comes a point in life for some people where everything is either contentment or complaining. It's like an on or off switch that every negative thing that happens just immediately switches on the grumbling and the complaining. And considering how little we actually are fully content in our lives, that means there's a lot of negativity, a lot of grumbling, a lot of complaining that's going to be taking place. Contentment does not come naturally. You can learn it. Paul talks about that. You learn contentment, but it doesn't come naturally. You can choose how to respond to being discontent, and it's possible to do so without grumbling. The word grumble or complain, especially in this section, it characterizes this Exodus generation. And as various places point out, this is not the generation of people that you want to be like. As the Hebrews author stresses from Psalm 95, God swore in his wrath they would not enter into his rest or Sabbath. Let us all try, just practice a more balanced approach to life. This doesn't mean that you ignore problems as if they don't exist, but you're not always dwelling on them and making our lives all about them. And let me suggest finally, let me suggest as well, sometimes our blessings comes in forms that we don't recognize. When the Israelites came out to see the answer to their prayers, it didn't look like what they were expecting. In fact, they didn't even recognize it. They simply said, "What is this? What is this?" Well, that was the answer. Folks, how often have we perhaps missed answers to our own problems because we ignore those answers since we don't recognize them for what they are? God brings about an answer, but it's not what we're expecting. We look at it and we say, "What is this?" And we assume it's not our answer, so we just keep on going. I'm sure you're all familiar with the story of the man who was alive during a flood period. It was a really bad flood, and his neighbor came over and said, "Hey, we're headed out of town. Do you want to hop in the car with us and go on?" And his neighbor's like, "No, that's all right. I'm fine. I trust God. He'll provide. I'll be fine through this." So the neighbor goes on. Well, the waters continue to rise. They get so much that he's having to be up on the second floor of his house because it's flooded all through the front. And a guy on a rowboat comes by and taps on the window, and he's like, "Hey, come on, get in. We'll take you to safety." And the guy's like, "That's okay, thank you. I have faith in my God. I trust him. He'll provide. You can go on." So the guy goes on. Finally, the waters get high enough. He's on the roof of his house. A helicopter comes. They lay down a ladder, and they say, "Hey, grab on. We'll take you to safety." And he says, "No, thank you. I trust God. He'll provide. You all go on ahead." And the man drowned. He died. And when he gets up to heaven, he has a conversation with God. He says, "God, what happened? I trusted you. You were supposed to save me. I told all these people I put my faith in you." And God looks at him and says, "Who do you think sent the car, the boat, and the helicopter?" He wasn't looking for these. What he was expecting was something else. How often do we do the same thing? Sometimes we might miss our help, our deliverance, our opportunities, our whatever, because it doesn't come in the manner we're expecting. Or sometimes we might get that deliverance and look at it and we might just say, "Wait, this is the answer? What even is it?" Sometimes our blessings come in forms we don't recognize. We need to keep our eyes open to see them and thank God for them. Finally, the bulletin article really goes into this. We have a Sabbath. The Sabbath is not something that as New Testament Christians is relegated to those Old Testament times. Folks, the Sabbath is just as pertinent and important to us as it has ever been to the people of God. It goes all the way back to the days of creation. Time does not allow me to give this discussion its full due. This is an introduction to the Sabbath system. Someday we'll talk more about this and its nuances. But I want to bring out the point the Hebrews author makes. He says, "There therefore remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God." There is a Sabbath rest that remains. As we live now in a now but not yet reality concerning this new creation, our hope rests on being with God forever in a new Eden. enjoying the Sabbath as God's creation. I mean, this is the whole point in Revelation 22. It says, "Then the angel showed me the river of water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, and through the middle of the street of the city, also on either side of the river, the tree of life, with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. Leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed," or no longer will there be a curse, "but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will have no need of the light of the lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever." Folks, the main pieces of Eden are right here in this text. This is our hope, that we're going to be there as well throughout all of eternity, reclaiming what was lost in Genesis chapter 3. There will be no more curse, no more separation, no more break in our relationship with God. And we will have a Sabbath rest with him forever. Let's bow together. Our great and almighty Father, we honor you, we glorify you, we love you, we thank you for all the incredible gifts that we have in our lives. We thank you for the manna that we receive, the various answers to our prayers, even when we may not recognize it for what it is. Help us to be people who always look to you without grumbling or complaining, trusting you to keep your promises you have made for us. We thank you for Jesus, the one through whom all these promises flow, and it's in his name we pray. Amen.